understand correctly. Wonderful. Okay, so we're continuing the second in our series on reading the Bible after the Holocaust. And as I mentioned last week, we are doing this as a way of seeing how the Bible speaks into issues of how one lives in the wake of humanitarian disasters. So the Holocaust is one frame, but there are many frames of things that happen in the world, happen in our own personal lives, that happen in our communities, where it just seems like things just completely fall apart. And so how can the stories, particularly in the book of Genesis, right, which speak very generally to all humanity, as well as the formation of the people of God beginning with Abraham. So we're kind of in a world of origins, right, when we do Genesis. And so we're taking a look over these next few weeks at the different stories in the book of Genesis and how might we see some different things by putting on this particular set of glasses. Right. So when I talk about reading after, it's really like reading in light of, or reading considering, or reading with this particular kind of a lens. Because in my study of it, I have found that using this lens is very helpful to see some things we might not otherwise see, right? Some things we might kind of read over. And today is one of those. One of those classes where I want to take you on a different kind of a journey, right, through the story of Cain and Abel. So actually today the handouts are going to be useful in class, in mine anyway. And I'll show you how that's going to work in a minute. So like we talked about last week, right, there's a number of things that we're going to focus on over this series. Today, we're going to talk about responsibility to others, right? What does the story have to do with the question of responsibility? What is our responsibility to each other? We're going to go one step further, right? What is God's responsibility to us, right? So we're going to look at both ends of that equation. And one of the reasons for looking at it that way is because it's the key question that the text presents us with in the story. Am I my brother's keeper? And we're going to unpack what seems to be a fairly simple statement, but there are some interesting things about that we should probably look at, right, to give us some additional insight. And so when we look at this statement, right, and I have a prayer that I found, please watch over my loved ones. I cannot be with them every moment, so I lift them up to you. Please keep them safe and help them to make right choices. And it's a beautiful little prayer, right? And I think it speaks to this thing that's in all of us, that we want and we expect and we pray, right, to God to look after us, right? Very normal, right? Something we do. This word keep becomes important. Am I my brother's keeper, right? Which is the central to the story. The word shamar there means what we call in Hebrew, it's a thick word, meaning that it has lots of different layers to its meaning. But generally, they all fall into keeping, guarding, protecting, watching over, taking care of, looking after. Those are all different ways that it could be translated. And in fact, that word is translated in many of these different ways throughout the Hebrew scriptures, and particularly in the Psalms. And so let's take a look at another question that comes up all the time in Holocaust studies, particularly the study of the Holocaust and theology, when those two things interact. This is a huge topic, and it's one that has been ignored and was ignored for a long, long time. And so the question comes up, well, where was God in the midst of all of this? Why did God let this happen? And why didn't God do something to stop it? Right? And I'm taking these questions from the literature on this topic itself, right? These are the questions, because there is a volume that came out probably in the early 2000s of Polish scholars on reflection on the Holocaust. And Poland as a country has had a really, really difficult time dealing with this subject because it all happened in their territory, right? Of course, Poland during World War II didn't exist, right? The state had been destroyed, right? And so it was not a sovereign state by any means, but still the land on which the majority of the killing took place either was before, was during, or was after part of how Poland defined its borders, right? Because the Poland before World War II had borders very different than what we have today, right? So you had part of Ukraine was included in Poland, part of Lithuania, that was part of Poland. You had the borders of Poland have been so contested over time. But all of the killing centers, which would have been Auschwitz, Majdanek, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Helno, these were the six center. Which one? Dachau was not a killing center, right? I was gonna say, the killing centers, the six killing centers were built specifically to murder people on an industrial scale, right? There were other concentration camps where killing took place, but other things happened there too, right? So, in fact, when you look at the landscape of all of Europe, and you look at the killing centers, the concentration camps, the transit centers, and then all of the subcamps of all of those, you come up with a number of about 44,000 places where atrocities took place, right? And a lot of them have been identified. They're still being excavated. So the scale was incomprehensible, right? So, but in this study of the Holocaust, particularly in Poland, there is, and you bring up the topic of anything that relates to theology, right? The big questions are, where was the church? What was the church saying or not saying? And the church can be, and that includes both the Protestant church, the Nazified Christian Church, which is the Deutsche Christen Church, and of course the Catholic Church, right? And those all have a similar history of silence, right? Now that doesn't mean everybody was silent, right? Doesn't mean everybody was, because there was a lot of people who did a lot of things, some of which we'll talk about in later lessons. So it's not everybody, but the Catholic Church in particular was such a huge political voice in the Vatican, where that's a whole complicated story, but there were people who begged the Pope at the time, please speak out against this. And it never really happened. The German Protestant Church, there were familiar, probably mostly familiar, the resistance movement, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was part of that, so you probably heard that name before. When Reinhard Niemoller, there's others who stood up against the Nazi state and but in terms of what was happening with the Jews, were not as vocal, right? The big issue in the churches at the time, and this relates to the idea of keeping, of watching over, right, was from the kind of Christian church that we would identify with. Their big concern was, how do we protect Jews who have become Christian, right? Because doesn't it count if a Jewish person has become a Christian, has put on Christ, now identifies as a Christian, doesn't that protect them from being rounded up along with the rest of the Jews? And of course, the answer is no, because the Nuremberg laws define Jewishness by blood, right? So you had, how do you protect your Jewish brethren? How do you do that? Well, some of them did it by, believe it or not, having two services, right? They had an early service for those Christians who were actually Jewish by blood. And the early service was because most of the SS officers weren't up that early. I mean, this is documented, right? And they'd have a later service that was restricted, right? It was only for Aryan Jews. So if someone came in and were raided, right? So it went, that was part of it, or others just, didn't want to have anything to do with it. So it's kind of the turning the blind eye, just like, we don't want to have anything to do with this. We're not going to engage it. There's a story of one pastor who, when he found out about the T4 program, which was the German euthanizing all people who were in some way disabled, which included, it wasn't just Jews, but it was anybody, stood up and wrote a letter of protest saying, this is wrong, right? And it went all the way up to Hitler via Joseph Goebbels, who's the propaganda minister. And Hitler wanted the person rounded up and shot. Goebbels actually argued, don't do that, because he's a prominent pastor in a large city, and if you get that person upset, they have too much influence. So the person was allowed to live, and the T4 program was actually suspended for a certain number of months. So it actually worked, right? Stand up and say something. The church standing up and saying something. The Jewish community, which is about 125,000 people in that area, heard about this and asked that same pastor, please speak up for us, because this is when the rounding ups were started and the shipping off to the camps in the early 1940s. This was beginning, and people knew about this. And the pastor refused, because that's too dangerous. And so eventually that 125,000 were made their way to the extermination camps. So these kinds of stories, right? There's hundreds of them, right? Of how to struggle with keeping. What is our responsibility in light of, things that are going on? What do we do? How do we negotiate this? So I think this is why this is important to look particularly at this story, right? And what does it have to say to us? So let's talk about this movie called God on Trial, right? I put the link in the handouts. It's a movie, you can watch the entire thing on YouTube. It's a true story about the rabbis in Auschwitz, a group of rabbis in Auschwitz that put God on trial for abandoning the covenant. So it's like, why are we here? I thought God was supposed to protect us, right? We are the chosen people. So, and we're dying and we're being shot and we're being killed in the millions, right? So where is God? And so the, again, this isn't a Hollywood thing. This is a true story. It was made into a book and then it was made into a film. The question was, well, has God abandoned the covenant? Or have we become secular and are we the ones that abandon God? Right? So you can argue it both ways. Well, we know from scripture itself that there are at least twice, three times actually, if you count the flood, when God got so fed up that and we'll get to this next week, right? That he killed off, right? I mean, the story, the one in Exodus, remember the golden calf story, right? Moses is up on the mountain. God hears the people dancing around the calf. And literally God says, I'm going to kill everybody and I'm going to start over with you. Right? And then Moses argues and says, don't do that. Because one, Pharaoh's going to think you just brought the people out in the wilderness to kill them. That's not going to be a good reflection on you. But two, remember your promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right. So this story is embedded in thought, in this thought. The same thing happens in Numbers, happens twice. So on that basis, the rabbis put God on trial and they find God guilty of abandoning the covenant, of finding a group of people that he likes better. And so the question is then, well, now what do we do? If God is guilty, what do we do? And the answer comes back, we pray. Because, sorry, dramatic moment, gone. The God is never off the table, right? There's an inherent, God is real, God exists. We don't understand. We think he's guilty, but where else can we go? Right, which is one answer, right? And so you've got this divide, right? Even within the Jewish community, even in the secular community, of we hold on no matter what. The other hand is we can no longer have faith at all, right? And so you've got these two sides that have been perpetuated since, right? It's this huge question, right? So how do we look at this? Well, let's go back to the story. And I want to talk a little bit about Havel. So we have two people in the story of Cain and Abel, right? We've got Abel and we have Cain, the two brothers. The name Abel in Hebrew is Havel, and that name means vapor, right? Here today and then gone. It's like the fog this morning. That's Havel, right? It's over us and then the sun comes out and it burns off, right? Cain's name has to do with strength and production, sort of a strong guy kind of thing. So you've got the two brothers represent contrasting states of being, right? One is vaporous and the other one is strong. Now, there's this really interesting relationship in the Hebrew scripture between the Torah, Genesis to Deuteronomy, and the wisdom literature, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job, right? Both are concerned with how do we live and how do we think, right? So they share that goal in common. What's really interesting is that The book of Ecclesiastes, if anybody remembers how it opens? Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. Or maybe it will say meaningless, meaningless, all is meaningless, right? There's lots of different translations. The word there that opens Ecclesiastes is the word Havel. Same word. Right? So you have this question about, yeah, Abel may have offered the best sacrifice, but Abel winds up dead in the end. Cain is the one who survives, right? And so you have a question about, well, I mean, one of the questions is, do you do the right thing because it's the right thing, even though you may wind up dead in the end? Or do you do the right thing to get a reward? Right? The question that comes up, right? But when you're talking about Abel in this story, you're talking about something that is, he represents a person who gains the gaze of God. But the question comes up, why wasn't Abel protected? Right? Particularly in the story, if God knows, from the story we know that he knows, that Cain has a problem. Right? So the question about keeping comes up. So before we go any further with that kind of introduction, on your handouts, you go to the back, there is the text on page, second page. You go to the page 6, so it's the next to last page, you'll see a script. And the story of Cain and Abel lays out perfectly as a little mini dialogue. And so we're going to read it in character. And what I want you to do is listen to who talks to whom and what do they say. Right? I want you to try to visualize it as a theater piece, because the whole story is a dialogue. So I need volunteers. Right? I need somebody to be Abel, who doesn't say anything, but whose blood cries out. So can you be Abel and cry out at the appropriate? Great. I need somebody to be Cain. Okay, Aaron, you can be Cain. I need someone to be a narrator. Okay, Jasper, you narrator. And I need somebody to be Eve. Okay, Anna, you can be Eve. And then I need someone to be the Lord. Okay, Laconia, be the Lord. I have. All right, so we're going to start out with the narrator. Just read your part, right?
Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain.
I have produced a man with the help of the Lord.
Next she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel, for his part, brought of the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions.
Yeah, you can read the direction.
The Lord has regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, he has no regard.
Okay.
Okay, very angry, and his countenance falls.
Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it.
Let us go out into the field.
You can read the directions.
When they are in the field, Cain rises up against his brother Abel and kills him.
Where's your brother? Abel.
I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?
What have you done? Listen. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth.
My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer upon the earth, and any who meets me may kill me.
Not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. The Lord puts a mark upon Cain.
And the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one who came upon him would kill him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. All right, so one of the things we have when we're reading a text is we don't necessarily have the information to know how a line of text was spoken. Right? We know what it says, but we don't know where the emphasis is in the words. And where the emphasis lies can change the meaning, right? So if I say, I love you, right? I love you is different than I love you, is yet different still from I love you. You hear the differences, right? And so that we have to kind of imagine that. So if we do the same thing with this word here, what is Cain actually saying? Now, the reason to do this, the reason to go here and use this method is because when we're thinking about reading after the Holocaust, we're talking about reading for people's humanity, right? People's humanity, are true or false? People's humanity is simple. False. Right? The complexity of a human being is often revealed in how we speak. So we have to look, we have to run this scripture around the block and look at how it might be said as we read for Cain's humanity. You with me so far? Right. So the first one, did he say, am I my brother's keeper? As if to say, is that my job? I thought it was your job, God, to look after me. As in, I thought it was you. Or is he saying, am I my brother's keeper? Right? Is like, am I responsible for him? Maybe that could be a way of shirking responsibility, or maybe it's like, I didn't know I had that job. Right? Which kind of goes along with the last one. Am I my brother's keeper? Like, I know he's my brother, but is keeping what I have to do? Now, we can read those questions with a valence of innocence, like he really didn't know. Or we can read it with guilt. That's a decision, right? You have to make. But on this first one, the question of who keeps who, it's worthy to note that Psalms makes quite a point of God being our keeper. Right? The Lord will keep you. Now, by the way, it's the same word used in Genesis 4. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and your going, both now and forevermore. right? The whole Psalm 121 is an affirmation of God as keeper. But in particular, in Psalm 121, he watches over your coming and your going. Where does coming and going take place? When you came and went this morning, what did you cross over? Cross through? A doorway. And where does sin crouch according to Genesis 4? At the door. Right? The transition points is what's actually being pointed out here, that the Lord keeps at the crossing point. So does Abel have a point? I'm not leading you, I'm asking a question. Does he have a point? Was that God's job? Or is all of this about Cain not realizing, not taking responsibility for being selfish and then killing Abel, right? This is a question, right? So when we think about that question, we read the rest of the story. Today you've driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer in the earth, and anyone who meets me may, oops. Then the Lord said to him, not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who came upon him would kill him. So what's the mark about? Keeping.
Yeah, it's sort of a protection.
It's a protection. So you see the issue.
Yeah.
In the story, it jumps out at us, right?
Right.
What? God's going to protect Cain, but couldn't he have done the same with Abel? Right? So what's going on here? Right? Cain did not keep Abel from being killed by Cain, but God did keep Cain from being killed by others. So what happened between here and here? The cry of the blood of Abel. That's important. Now, when Sheldon read that, this is where I had us read it. Sheldon, you made a choice about how that cry went, right? It was this soft, it was actually really brilliant. Well, because it was in keeping with the vapor, right? It was this soft, barely audible cry. To whom? What does the text tell us? The cry was directed at God, right? It was not directed at Cain. That's important because the blood, as it was able to have a voice, right, was crying out to God. What was the blood saying? Obviously, we don't. No, this is the part of the power of the story, right? It's making us think about this issue. What was this a place where, like other places in Genesis, I'm going to say this, so just go with me. Is this a place where God learns something? Now, that sounds strange. What happened when God created the Adam, the created being from the dirt in Genesis 2?
Oh, he's alone.
He was alone. Yes.
And that's not good.
That's not good. We need to fix that. Right? Is this a similar? Now, this is the very next story, right? I mean, after the expulsion from the garden. Is this a similar story about, I didn't realize there was going to be killing? Maybe. What happens then very next story? What's the next, what big story after this? After we get past the genealogies, what's the next big story after this? Genesis 6. The flood. Right? The world, we're going to talk about this next week. The world's covered with violence, which in Hebrew is the word Hamas. Still with us today.
Right.
Right? Covered with Hamas. God wipes the whole thing out, and then what happens? Yeah, it's like, I'm sorry I did that. Rainbow. Never gonna do it again. That's similar. Next big story is what? Genesis 11.
Sodom and Gomorrah.
That's the one after. But the next big one is Tower of Babel. Right? People building a tower. Right? God sees it and God says, let's go down and look. Right? Next big one, we got the first part of the Abraham story. Then we have Sodom and Gomorrah. Same thing happens, chapter 18. A cry goes up. This is chapter 18, verse 20, 21, 22. God says, I need to go down to see if the cry is altogether as bad. Right? So there's an investigation. There's a learning that needs to happen. So this is problematic. I know this is, but I'm raising it because in this early part of scripture, God is often portrayed in very human forms. Right? Now, we're not used to thinking about it that way, but if we take the text, let it kind of be what it is, we've got these points in here where we have to ask some questions. Right? So let's pull it back. Pull it back, right? Let's look at it in different ways. And so this will be, I'll open it up for Stephanie. Right. At what point does God intervene? Or at what point does God let humans being work out justice in ways that are mysterious to us? So is this question of responsibility that we're confronted with in the question, am I my brother's keeper? Is the real lesson there not so much what God did or didn't do, but is the point of that lesson is that we have to learn that learning responsibility for one another is something we have to learn and work at. We have to learn it. Does God leave us to our own devices so that we can pretty much learn things and grow up? Is that the point? Right? Or, what does it mean to look after or watch over or care for so that violence and harm does not escalate? Right? How do we, what's our responsibility there? And I'm not suggesting that we're all responsible for world peace. I'm not, that's not what I'm saying, but it really is wrestling with the question in the world I live in, the world you live in, your sphere of influence. What's our responsibility to our neighbor, right? Yes, we're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves, right? That's core. But, what does that look like? What does it mean? And then, of course, how do we learn to do better at keeping and watching over? And, is this something that the story shows us that when God is confronted with Cain's pain and his outcry, that what we're seeing is God's mercy and compassion for Cain, right? And is that something that God is doing for Cain, not to absolve him from the murder, but out of compassion for Cain in the aftermath, right? And so for us, it's the question of how do you care for someone who's guilty? Right? Do you write them off? because God didn't do that. When Cain, cries out to God, my punishment is too greater than I can bear. God doesn't say, well, you should have thought of that before you murdered your brother. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, well, you're just going to have to tough it out. I mean, you killed somebody else. Now it's your turn. Karma, not that. It's protection. Right. So we're seeing something, I think, really compassionate about God in this story. Right. We also have to ask the question about, well, what about Abel? That's questions off the table. So I'm done. I'll let that sit. And I want to say this. I don't mean to make you super uncomfortable. Although I kind of do. But that's not really the point, right? The point is to think, right? To think about the issue of responsibility and what has God done for us to protect us? What do we do for others to protect them? Okay, so now I really am finished. So, thoughts, comments? Yes, Aaron.
Well, we don't know from we don't know from Hebrew scriptures if the man cried out, if the Adam cried out because he was alone, but all these others are preceded with a cry for help.
Yes.
So that's probably the point where God intervenes. It's like, you're going to do what you're going to do. When you finally come to me, I'm going to help you out. But if you don't come to me, I can't help you. I'm just going to say, he's just forced to sit and watch because you don't ask.
Mm. And there really is consistency in what you just pointed out, that with the cry comes a listening ear. That is pretty fairly consistent.
The Jews of the Holocaust cried out.
Yeah, and
Yeah, what about them?
well, that's a great, that's why we're here. That's why this lesson's here. What about
It's
them?
okay for Cain, but what about 6 million Jews?
Mhm.
I'm lost. Totally.
Well, there were those who were working an underground railroad, which is the best metaphor for that, of sorts.
Mhm.
There were people that, I can't remember his name, but there was a Swedish ambassador that was giving Jews Swedish passports and shoved
Yes,
them out.
a lot of people were helping.
So there
A
was
lot
help.
of people.
There was, from with that cry came help, and eventually, the Allied nations defeated the German army, but
Yeah, John.
And I've got a great question. And I don't really have the answer, but I have stood in those gas chambers at Auschwitz and I wonder the same thing. And maybe the answer is the help came in the form of death. And death allowed them to escape those circumstances.
If you accept the message that I think we all try to accept when we read the Bible, is that where we're going is a hell of a lot better than where we are.
Mhm.
That is absolutely an acceptable response. But I mean, getting there is just brutal.
Anna.
I want to preface this by saying, as someone who has never suffered molestation or oppression of any kind, I have a little bit of an issue with people who blame God. Because, as was an example in this very first story, God put man here, not an automaton to do whatever he was told or programmed to do, but with free will. And he had to learn a little bit, like, what are these crazy creatures up to now? You know, I didn't, why did he kill his brother? People can be evil.
Mhm.
People can make mistakes that they don't mean. And our job, or one of our ways, we just have to try and put goodness out there and somehow eventually balance it out
Mhm.
or work to end it. And I don't know. if that makes
No,
sense.
it does. Your point about putting goodness out there.
Well,
Yes.
I hear it, Anna, but I also want to speak on behalf of those who might be blaming God. Because I
Mhm.
don't think they're blaming just God. I think what they're doing is they're trying to figure it out for themselves too. They, on
Mhm.
some level, it means that they're doing their own form of wrestling with God.
Mhm.
Because they're trying to figure out the answer also.
But in the meantime, God is learning also.
Mhm.
He's learning. You know, he didn't have it down pat all the way. He's learning and he's changing the way he operates. So,
And and through that, we have Jesus. Yeah, Jacqueline, then we have a.
This analogy of like parents and children and God as our parent. And the idea that he does watch over us. And he wants us to watch over each other. It's almost like he's, I don't know, I just picture a teacher or a parent or, someone watching a group of children and wanting to jump in every argument and, oh, don't do that, and make sure you share and make sure you do this. But he's not gonna do that. He wants to let us figure it out
Figure it out. Mhm.
and learn. And it's kind of that, like, I want you to want to love each other. Yes, he could force us to, but like Anna was saying, he put us here and let us choose
Mhm.
how we were going to act.
That's right.
So, and it's also just a horribly ugly example of like evil in the world too. He
Mhm.
conquered death, but there's evil
Still evil
at
in the
work
world,
too, very strong.
in the world. Yeah,
I think
Brad.
going along with that, unfortunately, humanity, one of our, flaws, one of our problems is that the more dramatic, the more terrible something is, the more likely we are to learn from it. So, if something weren't terrible and unbelievably tragic, would we still be talking about it today? Would we still be learning those lessons? Would we still be thinking about it with this sort of importance? I think that's a sad reality. We probably wouldn't. So, because my first thought was, well, yeah, if kids start pulling out knives and stabbing each other, you're gonna step in and do something.
Mhm.
But then again, you know what? If you end up having something really terrible, that's what changes our thinking. It's not small things. If the Lord did step in every time it started to go bad, we wouldn't learn. And I think
That's
that's more
right.
on us than him.
It is on us. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, one more, and then we have a
What
prayer.
about the actual parents, even Adam in the story, and where were they?
Mhm.
And what did they teach these children growing up without dealing with jealousy? And
Mhm.
because it seems like a very, oh, God likes your offering better, I'm gonna kill you. Like, it seems like a childish response to
Yeah.
me, that they perhaps should go down by this point with proper teaching.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Okay, Darren, our time is